It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was watering the pothos on my kitchen windowsill in Phoenix when the phone rang. My coffee was still hot on the counter, the light coming in gold through the blinds, and I almost didn't answer because the number wasn't one I knew, but something told me to pick up, and I did. The man on the other end had a careful, polite voice, the kind people use when they're trying not to sound like they already suspect something is wrong. He said he was calling to confirm a detail on the paperwork before the close on Friday. I said, "The close on what?" And there was this pause, long enough that I could hear him breathing, before he said, "The sale of Brooks Precision. You're Samantha Brooks, aren't you? The founder?" I set the watering can down. I remember that part exactly, the little clink of it against the tile, because everything after it feels like it happened underwater. I built that company from a rented garage bay off Van Buren 31 years ago, back when it was just me, a used lathe, and a business card I'd printed myself. Nobody sells Brooks Precision. Nobody sells it because it's mine. I told him there had to be a mistake, and he said, gently, like he was the one breaking bad news, that he had a signed letter of intent in front of him, brokered by a Daniel Reyes, who'd introduced himself as acting on behalf of ownership. Daniel Reyes is my son-in-law. He married my daughter Katie 4 years ago in a backyard with string lights, and I paid for the caterer, and I cried during the toast. The buyer cleared his throat and said the thing that turned the whole floor sideways under me. He said, "I have to ask, ma'am, why is your signature missing from the ownership documents?" I didn't answer right away because I was doing math I didn't want to do. And if you've ever trusted somebody so completely that you handed them a piece of your life without reading the fine print, you already know the cold that went through me. If stories like this one, real people, real trust, the kind that gets tested, are the kind you want more of, go ahead and like this video and subscribe, because I'm going to tell you all of it. For a second after I hung up, I just stood there in my kitchen with the water still dripping off the pothos leaves onto the counter, and I did the thing you do when your brain refuses a fact. I told myself the man had the wrong Samantha Brooks. There are probably a dozen of us in Phoenix, but he'd said the name of my company, the one I named after myself in a garage off Van Buren when I was 29 years old and too stubborn to know it was a bad idea. And there's only one of those. So I called Diane, who has run my front office for 19 years and knows where every paperclip in that building lives. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, whether anything strange had come across her desk lately. Contracts, lawyers, a man named Gregory calling for Daniel. And there was this little silence on her end, the kind Diane never has, because Diane always has an answer ready before you finish the question. She said Daniel had told everyone the meetings were about a new line of credit to expand the medical division. He'd said it was confidential. He'd asked her not to bother me with it because, and I could hear her hate repeating it, because he'd said I was slowing down and he didn't want to stress me out. I want to tell you who Daniel is, because if I don't, none of this will make sense, and you'll think I was a fool. Maybe I was. Daniel Reyes married my daughter Katie 4 years ago in my backyard under string lights I hung myself. He wore a gray suit and cried during his own vows, and I thought, this is a man who feels things. This is a good one. He called me Sam from the second day, which I let him do because it felt warm, like being folded into something. He was good with numbers, better than good. And he had that way of making you feel like the smartest decision you ever made was trusting him with the next thing. 3 years ago, my husband Bill got sick. It went fast. the way the bad ones do, and for about 8 months, my whole world narrowed down to a hospital parking garage and the sound of an oxygen machine. And I could not have told you the balance of a single account at Brooks Precision if you'd held a gun to my head. Daniel stepped in. Of course he did. He said, "Sam, you go be with Bill. I've got the shop." And he did have it. Payroll went out on time. The lights stayed on. And when Bill died and I came back into the building on legs that didn't feel like mine, Daniel had a folder ready, all my grief organized into tabs. Sign here, initial here. This is just to keep things clean while your head is somewhere else. I signed everything. I want you to sit with that for a second because it's the whole thing, really. A woman who read every contract for 30 years, who once made a supplier redo an invoice over an $11 discrepancy, signed a stack of papers without reading a single line because the man holding the pen was family and my husband was 3 weeks in the ground. That morning in March, standing in my kitchen, I didn't know yet what was in that stack, but I knew Diane's silence, and I knew the buyer's careful voice, and I knew the one thing Daniel had said to my office that made the whole floor tilt under me: slowing down. He'd told my people I was slowing down. That's the sentence a man uses right before he takes the wheel and tells everyone you asked him to drive. I told Diane to pull everything, every document with my name near it from the last 3 years. And then I got in my car, because there are some things you cannot find out over the phone. Brooks Precision makes parts you've never thought about and couldn't live without. Little machined components that go into surgical tools and aircraft brackets, the kind of work where a measurement off by the width of a hair gets somebody killed. So we don't make measurements off by the width of a hair. 41 people work there. I know all of their kids' names. Ray runs my shop floor and has since 2004, and when I walked in that morning, he took one look at my face and set down the caliper he was holding. And that's how I knew my face was doing something I couldn't control. I went straight to the conference room, and Diane started laying paper on the table in front of me. And here is where I have to slow down and tell you 2 stories at once, because that's how it lived in my head that whole terrible week. One eye on the papers in front of me, and one eye on the past, watching the trap get built in the exact places where I'd handed him the hammer. The first document that stopped my heart was an amended operating agreement, dated 4 months after Bill died. My signature was on it. Real. Mine. The loopy S I've made since high school. And in the language of it, buried in a paragraph about administrative efficiency, Daniel Reyes was granted what it called full management and operational authority over the company. At the time, I'm sure he explained it to me as, "This just lets me sign for supplies and payroll without chasing you down, Sam, so you don't have to come in on the hard days." And I'm sure I nodded. I was somewhere else. I was in a parking garage that didn't exist anymore, listening to a machine that had stopped. But here's the thing I clung to, sitting in that conference room with my reading glasses fogging up. Management authority is not ownership. It lets you run the place. It does not let you sell it. I still owned Brooks Precision. 60% of it, majority, the way I'd set it up decades ago precisely so that no one person could ever go around me. Daniel could sign for a shipment of tool steel. He could not sign away the company. So how? I kept asking Diane, how is there a buyer who thinks this is a done deal? That's when she slid the letter of intent across the table, and I saw how he'd done it. He hadn't claimed to own the company. He was smarter than that. He'd represented himself to the buyer as acting on behalf of ownership, with authority to negotiate and execute, and he'd handed them that operating agreement as his proof, the one with my real signature and the phrase, full management and operational authority. To a buyer in a hurry, that phrase in a signed document looks like a green light. Daniel was betting that nobody would read closely enough to notice that authority to manage a company and authority to sell it out from under its owner are two completely different animals. He was betting on exactly the thing he'd counted on with me in the first place. That trust makes people stop reading. And while I sat there understanding it, the second story kept playing behind my eyes, because I remembered now all the small ways he'd been taking the wheel and telling everyone I'd handed it to him. The time he'd redone the company email system and my address had quietly stopped getting the financial reports. The board he'd talked me into forming, 2 seats, him and a consultant friend of his named Owen, for governance, he'd said, for good hygiene. The consultant I'd met exactly once. I'd thought I was being modernized. I was being surrounded. Ray knocked on the glass and asked if everything was okay, and I said yes. Ray, everything's fine, because I didn't yet know how to say the sentence out loud. My son-in-law is trying to sell your jobs and mine by Friday, and he almost got away with it. And the only reason we know is that the man buying us noticed a signature that wasn't there. The lawyer's name is Ellen Cho, and she does not, as a rule, come in on the same day you call. She came in that afternoon. That's how you know a thing is bad, when the professionals rearrange their lives for you and stop making the reassuring small talk. She read for 40 minutes without saying a word, and I watched her face the way you watch a doctor reading a scan. When she finally looked up, she said the good news first, the way they teach you to, and the good news was real. I still owned my company. The management authority document was exactly what I'd hoped, a wide grant of operational power, but it never transferred a single share. On paper, in the eyes of the law, Samantha Brooks owned 60% of Brooks Precision, and no sale could close without my signature. The buyer's own attorney had caught it, which is why I got that phone call. Somewhere in a glass office across town, a careful lawyer had run his finger down a signature page and thought, wait, where is the majority holder, and refused to let his client walk into a lawsuit. Then Ellen told me the bad news, and the bad news was that Daniel had not been idle. In the weeks leading up to that Friday, acting under his management authority, he had signed things that were absolutely within his power to sign and absolutely designed to make the company easier to hand over and harder to save. He'd taken out a line of credit against our equipment, real debt, $500,000, and I could not for the life of me find where the money had gone. He'd signed a supply contract with a firm I'd never heard of on terms that were quietly terrible for us. He'd let 2 of my long-term client agreements lapse into a renewal window, the kind of window where a competitor who happens to be buying you can swoop in. Everything he'd done as a manager. All of it legal. All of it a knife. And this is the part that I keep coming back to, even now, because it's the truth underneath the whole story. Daniel never once broke into my company. I let him in. Every door he walked through, I unlocked, because he was married to my daughter and he cried at his own wedding, and he took care of things when I couldn't stand up. He mistook the fact that I trusted him with the belief that he was owed it. He confused being close to something for being entitled to it. And there is no lock in the world that protects you from a person you've handed the keys. That evening, Daniel called me, sweet as anything. Hey, Sam, Katie says you seemed off today. Everything okay? And I stood in my kitchen, the same spot where the whole thing had started that morning, and I made the hardest decision of that week, which was to lie. I said I was tired. I said Bill's birthday was coming up, and it always hit me around then, which was true, and which I hated using, and I could hear him relax through the phone, could hear him deciding I didn't know anything. He said, "You should rest, Sam. Let me handle the heavy stuff." Same words. Always the same words. "Let me handle it. Go rest. You're slowing down." I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time, and I understood that I had 2 days, and that if I confronted him now, he would simply move the close, hide the paper trail, maybe get Katie to sign something in a panic, and I would spend 3 years and everything I had in a courtroom trying to prove what I already knew. Ellen had told me the buyer's lawyer had questions. The buyer had questions. That meant the buyer was the one door in this whole nightmare that Daniel didn't control. So I did the thing Daniel never expected the woman who was slowing down to do. I picked up the phone and I called Gregory back. Before I tell you about that phone call, I have to tell you about Katie, because she was the wound underneath all of it, the one that no lawyer could fix. My daughter is 34 and she has my hands and her father's laugh, and she has spent her whole life believing that people are basically good, which is a thing I taught her and have never once regretted teaching her, even now. When she brought Daniel home, I watched her light up in a way I hadn't seen since she was small, and a mother will forgive a great deal of a man who makes her daughter light up. So the question that sat in my chest all week, heavier than the debt, heavier than the deadline, was the one I couldn't ask anyone but her. Did you know? I drove to their house on Wednesday night under the excuse of dropping off a casserole, which is what women in my family do when we can't say what we mean. Katie let me in, and she looked tired, and there was a stack of mail on their counter, and I saw, sitting right on top, an envelope from the same law firm on the letter of intent. It wasn't opened. And something in me eased just a fraction, because an unopened envelope is not the mail of a woman running a scheme. It's the mail of a woman who isn't being told things either. I stayed for an hour. I watched her move around her kitchen and I listened, and what I heard was a woman who thought her husband was under pressure at work, who'd been told the company was struggling and that Daniel was working around the clock to save it, who had signed. She mentioned it in passing while she filled the kettle. Some paperwork he'd asked her to sign. Something about the family trust. She wasn't really sure. He'd said it was to protect us. And I felt the floor go cold again, because I knew exactly how that sentence worked. He'd used the same key on her that he'd used on me. Grief for me, love for her. Sign here, don't worry about it, I've got you. I didn't tell her that night. I have gone back and forth 10,000 times on whether that was right. But I knew that if I told Katie the truth on Wednesday, she would confront him out of loyalty to me, and he would know, and my one open door would slam shut. I needed her not to know for 2 more days, and I have had to make my peace with the fact that to protect my daughter's future, I had to let my daughter stay in the dark inside her own house. I kissed her forehead at the door. I told her she was a good girl. She's 34, and I called her a good girl, and she let me. And I drove home crying so hard I had to pull over on the 51. The phone call with Gregory, when I finally sat down and made it, was not what I expected. I expected a shark. What I got was a tired, decent man about my age who ran a family manufacturing business 2 states over, and who had, it turned out, done his own due diligence and did not like what his instincts were telling him. When I told him who I was, the real majority owner, the founder, the woman whose signature was conspicuously absent from every document his lawyer had flagged. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Mrs. Brooks, in 30 years of buying companies, the deals that go wrong are always the ones where somebody's in a hurry to keep you from talking to the person you're supposed to be talking to." He didn't want to buy a lawsuit. He didn't want to buy a company by cheating the woman who built it. But he was a businessman with a real interest, and he asked me, fairly, what I wanted him to do about the meeting on Friday, the closing that Daniel still thought was happening, the one where my son-in-law planned to sit at the head of a table and sign away the thing my name is on. And that was the moment the whole week turned. Because I realized I didn't need to cancel that meeting. I needed to be in the room. I barely slept Thursday night. I sat at my kitchen table with Ellen's folder and I read every single page, the way I should have read them 3 years ago, and I made notes in the margins in pencil. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I stopped feeling afraid and started feeling something colder and steadier that I hadn't felt since Bill died. It was the feeling of being myself again. Sharp. Awake. The woman who caught the $11 discrepancy. Here was the plan, and it was almost insultingly simple, which is the only kind of plan that works. Gregory would let the meeting go forward exactly as Daniel expected. His firm would be represented. His lawyer would be there. Everything would look like a closing. Daniel would walk in with his consultant friend Owen and his folder and his easy smile, ready to sign on behalf of ownership. And at the point in the meeting where the buyer's attorney was supposed to slide the final documents across the table, they would instead ask one simple question, the same question that had started my whole week. Why is the majority owner's signature missing? And then the door would open. I got to the building early Friday and waited in a small side office Gregory's people had arranged, and I could hear them arrive, Daniel's voice in the hallway, warm and confident, cracking a joke about Phoenix traffic. I heard him say the word Sam once, to someone, in a sentence about how I'd stepped back from the business, how I trusted him to handle the future. Stepped back. Every time, a new gentle word for the same lie. I had stepped nowhere. I had been carried out on the shoulders of my own grief and told I'd walked. The meeting started. I listened through the wall to the small talk, the coffee being poured, the sound of a man who thinks he has already won, relaxed and expansive, talking about his vision for the company like it was already his to have visions about. I heard the buyer's attorney say, in a pleasant, unhurried voice, that before they proceeded, they had one point of clarification regarding the ownership documents. I heard the exact half-second where Daniel's voice changed, just slightly, the way a floor changes right before it gives. He started to explain the management authority. He'd clearly explained it 100 times in his head. Full operational control, he said. Acting on behalf of ownership, he said. And the attorney let him finish, and then said, very gently, that management authority and the authority to sell were not the same thing, and that a sale of this size required the signature of the 60% holder, and that the 60% holder was Mrs. Samantha Brooks. And Gregory said, "Why don't we ask her?" That was my cue, and I want you to know that I did not throw the door open. I opened it slowly and I walked in, and I set my pencil-marked folder on the table, and I looked at my son-in-law, the man who cried at his wedding, the man who held my elbow at Bill's funeral, and I watched 30 seconds of his life happen on his face all at once, the calculation, the disbelief, The search for the version of the story where this was still fine. There wasn't one. And I said the only thing I'd rehearsed, the thing I'd been saying to the dark of my kitchen for 3 nights, quietly, because you don't have to raise your voice when the papers in your hand are that loud. I said, Daniel, you kept telling everyone I was slowing down. I sat down at the head of the table, in my own company, and I opened my folder. And I said, I'd like everyone to understand exactly who owns this. The sale never happened. I'll tell you that plainly, because you've stayed with me this long and you've earned the exhale. Gregory shook my hand across that table, said it had been an honor to meet the person the company was actually named after, and walked away from the deal without a second look. Ellen spent the next several months undoing what Daniel had done, the debt, the bad contracts, the lapsed agreements. And it was slow, and it was expensive. But Brooke's precision is still mine. Ray still runs my floor. Diane still knows where every paperclip lives. All 41 of those jobs went home that Friday, still theirs, and most of those people never knew how close it came, which is exactly how I wanted it. But that's not the part that kept me up at night, and I think you already know that. Because I told you about the envelope on Katie's counter. I told her on a Sunday. I didn't do it with lawyers or folders. I made coffee and I sat my daughter down at my own kitchen table, the same one where all of this started. And I told her the whole thing slowly. The way you tell someone a truth you can see is going to change the shape of their life. I watched her go through it in real time, the confusion, then the disbelief, then the terrible moment where she stopped defending him because she remembered the paper he'd asked her to sign for the family trust, the one to protect us, and she understood what her own hands had been used for. She put her face down on the table and she cried like she was small again, and I held the back of her head, and I did not say, I told you so, because I hadn't told her so. I'd raised her to believe people were good. He'd just counted on that too. Katie's the one who has to decide what her marriage is now, and that's hers to carry, not mine to tell you. What I'll say is that she called me last week to ask if she could come learn the business, really learn it. She sat at that lathe Ray taught her on when she was 9, and she asked me to show her how to read a contract, every line, out loud. And I have never in my life been so proud to watch someone be suspicious of a piece of paper. Here's the thing I keep, out of all of it. I don't regret trusting people. I'd rather be the woman who hangs the string lights and cries at the toast than the one who reads every face for the con. But I learned, late and hard, that trusting someone and handing them the keys to your whole life are 2 different things, and that the people who love you never once confuse being close to what you built with being owed it. Daniel was family. That was never the problem. The problem was that he thought family meant it was already his. If you've got someone in your life who keeps gently telling everyone you're slowing down, who wants to handle the heavy things so you can rest, I'm not saying be afraid of them. I'm saying read the paper. Read every line. There's another story I've been turning over about the day a stranger showed up at my shop asking about a debt I never took out, and how a woman I'd never met turned out to know more about my company than I did. But that one needs its own quiet evening. Stay close, and I'll tell you.